bought rain. The valley will pay the price. Get down! Now!
The Rainmaker's ledger. The last of the wells had begun to cough sand by noon, a dry rattle that made people look at the sky even when they knew there was nothing up there but a white sheet drawn tight. Chickens scraped dust and blinked in slow misery. The creek at the edge of town did not even have the decency to stink. It was a line of black stones and a memory of water in the darker patches of dirt. In that heat, a wagon rolled out of a shimmer and came down the lane with a rattle of boxes and a crooked banner that read, "Rain on command," in letters that had once been proud. The horse was long in the back and short in the patience, but it pulled. The driver stood as he rolled, hat at a careful angle, coat too fine for the road. In the wagon bed, brass and pipe and dials and jars clinked like polite glassware at a party that had no business in this valley. Children came to their porches without being told. Men stood in doorways with arms folded to keep hands from doing something foolish like reaching for hope. Women paused at washboards and let the boards rest on the lip of the tubs, eyes on the contraption, as if it might assemble a sky from parts. The Rainmaker, for that is what the driver called himself, stopped in front of the store and lifted his chin as if to greet a balcony of strangers. He spoke with the roll of a salesman who has sold to men with knives and to church ladies with weak afternoons. He said that even a hard land will listen if you ask it the right way. He said the right way was smoke and silver and a drum beat the clouds remember from before they learned to be stingy. He said he would run his apparatus for coin and for grain and for anything a decent town could spare. And that when he had finished, if the town did not see results, he would roll on with no hard words behind him. He said all that and smiled, a smile that had fixed many crowds, maybe even some that needed fixing. The badge watched from the porch with a wire in hand that said a lot and little. The wire said Drought had its boot on every neck between here and a salt flat 3 days east. It said cattle were dying on their feet and men were thinking about stealing each other's shade. It said a reservoir up in the high country had been left to silt and rats by men who took their ledger east in a carpet bag after the last gold ran thin. The wire did not say rain. Wires rarely say the one word a place needs. The rider came up the street on a plain horse and slid down without hurry. He read the wagon with the eye he gave to any machine that promised much and ate fuel. Copper coils, a big drum for burning, a rack of rockets with sticks real straight, jars with cloudy crystals and a vial of silver solution, good enough to stain the skin if spilled. A leather mailbag tied at the back with a knot men use when they mean to untie it fast. He did not stare at the bag. He looked at the sky and then at the healer's window, where a curtain moved because hands had pushed it, and not because wind had breathed on it. The old tracker spat in the dust and watched it sit there and thought about snow lines and how far down they had crept on the ridge. He spoke soft to a boy who had followed him out of the livery and said a word about teeth. Drought has them. It eats the edges off people first, then the middle, and the bones last if you let it. The boy nodded as if to say he was writing that down somewhere in a book that would not be looked at until after he needed it. By evening, the Rainmaker had set his apparatus on the hill above the square, where wind carried smoke away from houses that could not afford a spark. He built a tripod out of pipe and tied it with wire and strung the rockets along a rail that used to be a curtain rod for a theater. He set a drum on bricks and filled it with a terry mix that smelled like the inside of a nail factory. He poured a thin stream of silver nitrate into a sprayer and pumped it until the leather cracked. He had a helper then, a young man with a careful mouth, and a habit of looking at the horizon as if it might apologize if he caught it at the right angle. The town gathered, because people will gather for spectacle even when their tongues stick to their teeth. The badge stood near the drum, arms folded, hat pulled down. The rider stood farther back where he could hear the land if it said anything worth hearing. The healer brought a bucket of water for Burns and a tray of cloth that had been boiled 3 times because she knew how nights go when men decide to improve weather with fire. The old tracker lay on his side with his head on his arm and watched the line of the ridge for a thin smear that might be more than smoke. At dusk, the Rainmaker struck a spark. The drum took the flame and turned it into a hungry, dark bloom. Smoke rolled and climbed and flattened and rolled again. The Rainmaker beat a low rhythm on a skin stretched over a barrel, and the helper turned the sprayer into the dark and sent silver into an updraft that was not there enough to be believed, but enough to be noticed. The rockets screamed one by one into the white and left vias of ash that drifted like thoughts you do not want to think, but cannot stop. The town lifted faces and watched smoke do what smoke does, which is climb, spread, and decide late whether to be anything but ash and regret. A breath of wind came down from the high country after full dark. It tasted like dust and cold iron. The smoke leaned east. The Rainmaker raised both hands and said a single word that did not belong to any language anyone in that valley had used before. It was a showman's word, made to fit the space between hope and purchase. The word did not move the sky, but a thin line on the ridge did. A smear that had been chalk a minute ago took a gray tone at the edges. No one exhaled. The rider did not look at the smear. He looked at the corner of his eye where a cloud enters if it does not want to be caught head-on. There was something there. Not rain. Movement. They ran the rig past midnight. When the drum had eaten its fuel, the Rainmaker fed it boards from the wagon floor and said he had planned that all along. He sent the helper to the creek bed to bring back rocks for weight. A man with a window frame for a face told him he would not give a nickel for a tea kettle of smoke if the sky refused to be polite. The Rainmaker nodded like a man who had heard worse up north in a place where factories made weather of their own. He did not argue. He never argued. He told the helper to fetch the last jar and the little box of magnesium strips. He said the last show always needs a last bit of light. A flicker went along the ridge that had nothing to do with any strip of metal in a box. Lightning walked from one dark knob to another, and then out over open air where no one had expected it to go. It was heat lightning at first, a silent stepper. Then a sound came, not the clap that scares cattle, but a far-off drag like a table pushed across a wooden floor. People looked at one another. The badge did not smile. The rider said the line you say to luck when it passes your shoulder. Easy. At the clinic, the healer counted jars and then counted people she knew slept in the lean houses by the draw, because if rain came too fast and from the wrong angle, the draw would turn to a knife. She set a lantern low and wrote a note for the boy who ran swift when told. The note said, go to the east fence and tell them to pull their animals to the high pen and to tie their doors open so doors would not trap the slow. She tucked the note under a ribbon on the boy's hat and touched his head and watched him run. Shortly after midnight, clouds climbed out of the hills and stood where they liked. They were not born of smoke or silver or drum. They were weather-tired of waiting for men to act decent. The leading edge lifted and laid down a sheet of breath that made dust do things it had forgotten. A gust moved. A sound spoke from the ground up, a low tone from stone that has been dry too long and wants to sing for joy and for fear at the same time. Someone laughed and someone cried and someone else did both, because those two sit at the same table when a sky finally remembers a valley. First drops hit so far apart you could hear each one land. Then they came close enough to sow a sound. The town looked up and let the first be what it was. Men who had walked hard and kept their mouths bitter became boys for a handful of heartbeats. Women who had taught children how to swallow without water opened their hands to make cups that caught nothing useful and everything necessary. The Rainmaker stepped back from his apparatus and lowered his hands. He did not take credit loudly. He looked at the ridge with a twist in his mouth that a person who knew him better would have called worry sneaking around the back way. The old tracker sat up and put his ear to the ground under the sound of rain. He did that because he knew water does not just fall, it gathers. Line feed lines and small turns into lean run smart if you teach it early. He heard something he did not love. A roll, not like the good belly roll of a river, but like a body shifting in a bed that should be empty. He looked at the rider and tapped his own chest twice. The rider nodded. Both men looked at the Rainmaker together. The Rainmaker had the look of a man planning a disappear. He had the look of a man who had done so before and been forgiven by no one, and by himself least of all. The badge saw three things: the rain on the square, the darkness where the draw ran, the mailbag tied at the back of the wagon. He stepped to the bag and set a boot on the strap. The Rainmaker saw that. He shook his head without offense, the way a man shakes when a brother catches his jacket before he walks into a stairwell without lights. He lifted his hands palm out. He said a quiet line about debt. It did not mean money. A roar came then from east, from high country. It was not wind. Wind never has that roundness in it unless it is dragging something heavy. The draw answered with a low growl. The old tracker stood. He pointed to the black notch in the ridge where the old reservoir had been left to leaf and rot. He said words about an earthen dam and a spillway choked by spring's greed and a plank gate swollen and stuck. He said what comes was not just rain. It was stored water and stored neglect. He said the first rush could take pig fences and porches and anything not built to taste teeth. The rider did not speak. He moved. The badge moved with him. The Rainmaker hesitated only long enough to turn one valve on his boiler to save what fuel could be saved, which is a thing a man does when he expects to be useful elsewhere in an hour. He grabbed a coil of hose and 3 wrenches, and the little box that had magnesium but also a few bright blades that were for cutting leather in the dark. The helper took the sprayer without being told and slung it hard over a bony shoulder that had been hungry too long. They ran. Up the lane, past the mill, along the ridge of the draw where mesquite sniffed the air and shrugged rain off with spite. The ground made sucking noises as if it wanted to keep men's boots for later study. The bell did not ring. No one had untied it. The sound underfoot did not need a bell. It talked to bones. The healer had already moved toward the east fence, and by the time the men passed, she was lifting a latch that did not match its post anymore, because wood shifts when it has not been rained on, and then is. At the notch in the ridge, the old reservoir sat like a black mouth with lips of mud. The dam was a low wall of earth and brush and rock, patient in the way of something built to hold, while men drink and forget to say thank you. Water crawled through the spillway, then pushed harder than it had any right to. In the middle of the spillway, a tangle of limb and wire, and a carcass of a long, dead tree, made a plug that the first push could not undo. The second would. You can tell a door about to give by the sound it makes, when a man impatient with it leans a shoulder and counts to 5. The badge scouted the flank and shook his head. No way around that would not take until after the valley had learned a hard lesson. The rider looked at the face and saw how silt makes a lie of strength under a thin skin. The Rainmaker looked at the old gate gear up on a splintered platform and saw a pair of iron screws that had not turned in 3 summers. He smiled then, but not showman-wide. He smiled like a mechanic watching a stubborn machine decide to confess its problem. He slung the hose over a beam and made a simple siphon the way a barn man would when he cannot be bothered to fetch buckets twice. He primed it the hard way, by mouth, spitting grit and old taste, because time was not in the mood to be borrowed. The helper ran the sprayer wide to clear small channels, which is fool's work if you do it without thinking, but fine work if you aim for places that cut bigger places later. The old tracker took the broad shovel and put his back into the left lip of the spillway, because you do not attack the whole of a thing when the edge will take a lever. The plug held. It held as if it had a dog's jaw on a bone, teeth sunk, shoulders braced. Rain made the wood slick. The platform creaked in a language that says men once stood there and shouted at clouds, and now those same men were retired far off and drank city water that had learned to run through pipes. The badge wrapped rope around a post and around his waist and leaned. The rider laid a plank along the gear and put 2 boots on it to make a new kind of wrench with flesh for a handle. The Rainmaker found a can of boiled linseed and a smear of old tallow, and rubbed it into threads that did not want kindness. He muttered to the screw like it was a mule that had forgotten who owned it. The screw did not move. A deep hum rose from inside the earth under the dam. That hum did not care what men asked. Below and to the right, a thin black ribbon appeared over the lip of the dam where no water had belonged a minute before. The old tracker swore once, not at the ribbon, but at a memory of a flash flood that had taken a friend who was strong enough for 3 men in a saloon but not for a wall of wet, that made his bones sing on a rock and made his name a story told flat. He threw the shovel to the rider and said with his hands, "Dig here, not there." The rider dug. Mud came up that smelled like old leaves and iron. The Rainmaker slid off the platform, turned his back to the screw, put his fingers under the plate with the swollen gate and heaved. The helper pushed the sprayer through the plug like a lance, because sometimes men take ridiculous shots, and sometimes those are the only shots that make a door remember how to be a door. The plug quivered. Not much. Enough for the rider to see the surface above go from calm to a mean little drawdown swirl that says a thing is choosing a route. The badge yelled a name that was not anyone's, just a sound men used to line their backs. The Rainmaker lifted again and found an inch where there had been none. The screw squealed. A little water passed where it had not. The little became a line and then a line with edges. The rider stepped into the spillway below. The plug took one cut with a short iron blade at a rope that had caught a root and moved out before the cut could turn into a hand that would not let go. The dam gave in the sensible way, not in the dramatic way that breaks songs and fences. It did not burst. It flexed, and then allowed. The plug floated and twisted and lodged on the far edge against the jag at the lip the tracker had been undermining with each shovel bite. The badge leaned and the rope burned his palms, and he leaned harder because palms mend and low ground does not. The Rainmaker got the screw to take a half turn, and then another, and the gate lifted to the thickness of a hand, which is often the difference between a funeral and a story, told at a table with a laugh at the end. Water ran. It did not rage. The first push went down the spillway and over rock that had dreamed of this day, and remembered how to make its back slick the right way. The rider stood mid-channel, boots braced, and used the shovel to pull branches and wire and dead things toward where they would shove off clean instead of tangle. The helper fell twice, and got up the way men do when a second fall would turn them into a list of things to remember later for other reasons. The old tracker watched how new water met old dirt, and guessed what places would lie about their strength an hour from now. He shouted once and pointed, and the rider nodded and put 3 cuts in the bank that gave the flood a fork to choose rather than one door to break. While men worked iron and mud, rain walked out of the hills and over the valley like a team of tired horses that refuses to quit. It sheeted the square in a way that made every nailhead a little mirror. It drummed the clinic roof. Inside, the healer had the east pen stacked with people wet, and smiling and scared and trying to hand her their gratitude like that could be stacked on shelves next to bandages. She took it, because taking that sort of thing is part of the job. She sent the boy to tell the others that the first rush had been guided, not beaten, and that if they would keep to high ground and let the water take the low for a while, morning might have more bodies upright than down. By dawn, the dam had let what it would and the spillway ran clean. The edge of the plug rode a lazy circle in a calm pocket, and then slid over and was gone, taken downstream to lodge somewhere it would do less harm than good. The valley drank in the places that had learned to drink. The hard patches sobbed and then eased, because that is how ground does when it has been starved and then fed. The creek that had been a line of stones made a sound like a dog dreaming. The smell that rose from the earth made older men look at each other and forget to scowl for a beat. The Rainmaker stood on the platform with one hand on the screw and the other on his lower back, as if to apologize to it for work done out of habit rather than out of good training. The badge climbed up and set a hand on the iron, and then on the man's shoulder and did not say anything, which is how some thanks are best delivered. The rider was already down in the spillway, setting rocks as teeth, where teeth would train the next flow to think twice before it took liberties. The old tracker leaned on the shovel and let his head hang for 3 breaths, and then started in on another little cut. Because a valley is a thing you finish only for a minute at a time. They went back to town in a light that had really earned the word morning. Faces showed at doors with hair down and eyes red and soft and hard in all the right ways. People called small things across fences. Did you see the low pen? Did you tie your door? Did you taste the first drop? Men who had not hugged since last winter slapped arms, and then some of them did better and just stood close and let the day lay a hand on both of them at once. Women who had not let anyone help with a pail let hands reach, and those hands did not spill much, because hands learn fast when they want to. At the square, someone had left a parcel on the rail, wrapped in cloth. Inside were coins and a strip of clean bandage and a biscuit that had gone soft in the damp and still smelled right. The badge looked at it and the rider looked at it, and the Rainmaker pretended to be surprised by how those parcels show up when a town has decided to stop paying the wrong people. The badge said the words he always said about it not being pay. The Rainmaker nodded in a way that meant he understood this language better than he had any right to after a single night. He did not take the parcel. He set it back on the rail and let folks who needed to see it, because seeing that and smelling it does a certain work in the chest that nothing else does. At noon, the sun pushed through and made steam rise off every board. Chickens ventured out and looked offended at the way dirt behaved. The mill wheel turned because water asked it to, not because whatever had walked the lane the other night had asked it to out of mischief. The Rainmaker took apart his apparatus and dried metal with a cloth. He packed rockets that had not been fired. He cleaned the drum with sand and a stick and taught the helper the trick of doing a dull job with pride, which is a thing valuable men know how to pass on. People gathered in a loose ring around the wagon as a matter of form. The Rainmaker could have made a speech and been forgiven for it. He did not. He said he would collect only what had been promised if the sky moved. And he asked that the badge hold the coins because a certain kind of man is better with money that is not his. The badge said he would, and he did. The rider watched a line of gray cloud hanging stubbornly on the far horizon and counted the hours before heat lifted it and wrung it dry. The old tracker whittled a stick and let the curls fall to the wet dust where they glued themselves into small fossils. In the afternoon, the Rainmaker found the rider by the creek, where the water backed into calm pockets that made bright skins with the slightest wind. He said he had done wrong in places that had not forgave him yet. He said he never learned to pray good, but had learned to listen to machines and rivers, and how both will do a thing if you ask at the exact right time in the exact right voice. He said he had tried to be an honest fraud and hated that sentence as soon as it left his mouth. The rider did not let him drown in it. He said a job had been done and that the land would decide what to do with the man who did it. He said a ledger made of bone and water had been marked, and that mark would travel in the right direction if its owner kept his feet under it. Toward evening, a pair of wagons came down from the upper farms with boards in the beds for decking and sacks of grain under a tarp too clean for field work. The men on the seat wore coats that had met rain only on the outside and hats that had never met it at all. They eyed the apparatus leftovers and eyed the badge and eyed the Rainmaker as if a bill might be owed, not to him, but to the world. They said they had come to collect a fee for water trapped on their land that had been released without written say-so. They said their lawyers had pens that did not run when they met weather. The badge said a thing about dams and rights and the sound of a fork in a stream. And the men looked at the creek and did not see any of the things the badge said. The Rainmaker pulled the mail bag from the back of his wagon then, the one the badge had set a boot on the night before. He opened it and took out a little ledger with a soft leather cover and the habit of a man's hand in its spine. He turned to a page with a date 6 months old and a line in it that was the name of a town another day and 3 states away. He read a sentence about a box of pipe carried on credit for the purpose of repairing a sluice gate at an abandoned reservoir. He read another about a drum purchased with coin not held by the buyer at the time for the purpose of making weather-answer men. He read a third line about interest to be charged until a certain thing came to pass. Then he tore that page out and set it on the rail and set a coin on the page and a second coin on the first, and said the words a man says when he pays a debt and means to carry the habit forward into days that may not deserve it. The men on the wagon looked at the page and at the creek and at the way the town stood without folding its arms. They sat, which was not what they had meant to do. One of them leaned and picked up a wet stick and made circles in the dust because men need to move something when their mouths are not ready to talk sense. The other looked at the sky and noticed that rain had left the air kind and that you could smell grass again, even where no grass yet grew. They left without promise and without threat, which is sometimes the second best outcome after what should have happened, and rarely does. The badge folded the torn page and put it in his pocket, because men lose fingers and forget better than pockets do. The rider took a walk along the new edges of the creek and made little ditches with his heel, that the next rain might read as instructions. The healer sat on her steps and let the last of the damp soak her apron, and did not move to stop it, because that is a kind of indulgence a body deserves after nights like that. The Rainmaker left before dawn the next day. No speech, no wave. He had a habit of leaving that came from years of getting out of places before they remembered all the things he had been before the thing he was for a minute. He tied the mailbag under the seat this time, not at the back. He left the little ledger on the rail with 2 coins under it and a line on the top page that said, "Leave this with the badge until you decide whether I owe you more." The badge found it before sun. He did not count the coins. He put the ledger in the drawer where stubborn notions get kept so they can put weight on flimsy ones when needed. A week later, the land wore the sort of green that looks like a new shirt on an old man. Handsome and maybe a little silly and beautiful, because it is both. The creek ran with less pride and more purpose. The spillway held and taught the next push how to behave. The old tracker took the boy up the ridge and showed him where the first drop had cut, and where the fork had saved a fence, and where,